From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, October 28th, 2014. Breast Cancer Action criticizes the Komen Foundation. An indigenous activist named Leo Serda joins us to discuss what's happening in the Amazon rainforest and a look at the Senate elections that are coming up in just 1 week. That's coming up after the news. Joining us to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, the FBI has raided the home of a federal contractor suspected to be a whistleblower. The person in question apparently provided documents to intercept reporters Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Devereaux about the government's watch list program. The raid took place in Northern Virginia, where federal prosecutors have begun a criminal investigation. The unnamed whistleblower, who's been likened to Edward Snowden, was briefly alluded to in Laura Poitras's new film about Snowden entitled Citizen 4. Documents leaked to The Intercept laid out classified criteria that the U.S. government uses to place Americans and others on the list and subject them to extra scrutiny at airports. Yahoo News, which broke the story, reports that the Justice Department may be reluctant to pursue charges. Well, Bob, do you think that the skillful way in which journalists like Glenn Greenwald and Scahill and Poitras broke their stories has generated better public support for whistleblowers?
I think that public support is starting to build. I wouldn't overestimate the amount of support right now. I think much of the American public still sees this as a non-issue for them because they see this as primarily targeting immigrants, Arab, Muslims, South Asians, whatever it is. So unfortunately, I'm not sure it's growing at the rate we might want to. But I think the thing that's going to undermine support in the public for this action is how the U.S. government isn't keeping it safe. The claim has always been we have to make these interventions, we have to do this surveillance to keep us safe. And the more we know that they're not keeping it safe, for instance, that this watch list has so many people on it that it's essentially meaningless, I think that's going to help a lot to build public support to resist this kind of surveillance.
And in another story of government surveillance, the New York Times has reported that the U.S. Postal Service has been cooperating with requests for tracking the mail of ordinary Americans. In fact, 50,000 requests from law enforcement agencies and USPS's own inspection department were approved last year alone. The Times obtained an audit of the Postal Service through a Freedom of Information Act request and found that the surveillance program, quote, is more extensive than previously disclosed and that oversight protecting Americans from potential abuses is lax. Now, Bob, in reading the story, I'm reminded of our public library system around the country and how librarians took a bold stand after the September 11th attacks against government surveillance. They refused to cooperate. Are you disappointed that the U.S. Postal Service doesn't seem to have taken a similarly strong stand for privacy?
Well, disappointed, but not surprised. Remember, the U.S. Postal Service, however nominally independent it is very dependent on the U.S. government. And given the thin ice it's on for funding, I'm not at all surprised that the post office capitulated quickly. That's a very horrifying story that I hope people will read, not only for this particular revelation, but a reminder that the post office does this thing called mail imaging, which allows them to take a picture and store every piece of mail that goes through the Postal Service. And that is a record that could be used in incredibly invasive ways. There were some interesting examples. For instance, everybody's favorite sheriff down in the Southwest, Joe Arpaio, had used it against a county supervisor. This is one of those potentially incredibly invasive technologies that we have to be aware of.
And then finally, a report this week based on the testimonies of young Nigerian girls who escaped their captors paints a grim picture of what they experienced. The militant Nigerian organization Boko Haram, which took credit for the kidnappings that captured global attention, apparently raped many of the girls and forced them to convert to Islam. Some of the young girls are as young as 15. Hundreds remain in captivity. In recent weeks, the Nigerian government announced a possible peace deal with Boko Haram, but some government officials themselves have been linked to the organization. Now, Bob, this story slipped out of the media consciousness, and our news headlines these days are dominated by the crisis of Ebola from West Africa. But as is the case with Ebola, isn't poverty and inequality the underlying cause of Nigeria's problems?
Yeah, this is one of those cases where we have to constantly remember the context. The American public is quick to take episodic news and treat it episodically. And of course, there's a deeper context here. We have to go back and keep talking about colonialism, the way that Europe destroyed Africa. We have to talk about post-World War II Cold War politics and how that created even deeper problems. And then we have to talk about the existing economic and ecological crises, these twin crises that are affecting the developing world far more than the developed world. As bad as things are in the US, we have to remember that around the world, these problems are coming to bear in even more dramatic ways. All of this is important context, historical, social, economic, ecological context. And my fear is that, especially halfway around the world, the American public is going to treat this kind of dismissively as, well, that's Africa, what can we do? But of course, we bear responsibility for that history and have to stay engaged.
Bob Jensen, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Tuesdays. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. When we come back from a break, we'll take a look at how the Komen Foundation is in the news again, and not for a very good reason again. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. We're broadcasting on Free Speech TV, and you can check us out every weekday at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 6 p.m. Eastern. We're on Dish Network and DirecTV. The Susan G. Komen Foundation is in the news again, and it's not for a good reason, again. This time, the nation's leading foundation raising money for breast cancer research and awareness has been shamed by activists for partnering with a company engaged in the controversial practice of fracking, or hydraulic fracturing. That's a form of gas and oil extraction that uses toxic chemicals and contributes to pollution and climate change. The fracking company, Baker Hughes, showed off its partnership with Komen by proudly displaying drill bits painted bright pink with the tagline, "Doing our bit for the cure." The company is distributing 1,000 such bits to oil fields all over the world. The trouble with this obvious case of pinkwashing is that some of the very same chemicals, such as naphthalene and lead, that Komen Foundation lists on its website as potentially cancer-causing chemicals, are used by fracking companies to drill for oil and gas. The group Breast Cancer Action, which has criticized the practice of pinkwashing, started a petition publicly calling on the Komen Foundation to, quote, "stop fracking with our health," which more than 150,000 people signed. BCA confronted Komen's founder, Nancy Brinker, at the Pittsburgh Steelers NFL game on Sunday, where she was planning to accept a $100,000 check from Baker Hughes. The last time the Komen Foundation came under fire was for cutting off funding to Planned Parenthood in 2012. My guest is Karuna Jagger. She is the Executive Director of Breast Cancer Action. Welcome to Uprising, Karuna.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first explain to our listeners what the practice of pinkwashing is and how has the Komen Foundation engaged in it?
Sure. So pinkwashing is more than just selling pink ribbon products. It's more than just pink ribbon promotions. And there's a lot that we can say about pink ribbon culture and pink ribbon marketing. There are follow the money questions. There's questions of ways in which many of these promotions degrade women, hide the serious realities and social justice issues of this disease. So there are plenty of critiques of pink ribbon culture and marketing. Pinkwashing is specifically when the very same companies that claim to care about breast cancer are selling products or services which actually put women at increased risk of the disease. And so it's just the most cynical and really ingenious profit cycle for companies to partner up with nonprofits, where on the one hand, the company is contributing to the increased risk of breast cancer, and on the other hand, the nonprofit is raising money to provide services or even to try to cure this very disease. It's what we call the cancer industry. So rather than Breast Cancer Awareness Month, we call October Breast Cancer Industry Month.
Wow. Well, the response to your petition against the Komen Foundation's partnership with Baker Hughes was amazing. 150,000 people signed it. Tell us what happened at the Steelers game over the weekend. Did the check granting ceremony go through?
Yeah, it was really exciting to see the public uprising. We had close to 170,000 petitions. We, Breast Cancer Action, collected petitions along with our partners, Credo Action, Oil Change International, Food and Water Watch, and EcoWatch. And in just a little over 2 weeks, close to 170,000 people signed this petition pushing back on this pinkwashing. We saw the world's largest breast cancer charity partnering up with one of the world's largest fracking companies. And after delivering the petitions on Friday, and Komen had certainly felt the public pressure. There was a lot of media coverage of this issue, in addition to the petitions. And on Sunday, they were scheduled to receive a check from Baker Hughes at the Steelers game. We also had a rally and an action at the Steelers game, passing out information to the football fans about this pinkwashing. We had very positive response from the fans. And our folks inside the game reported that there was no public ceremony. Now, it's the first step to say, if pinkwashing is nothing but a publicity stunt, basically Baker Hughes is trying to generate good PR by donating $100,000 to Komen, and we know that they spent far more than $100,000 painting 1,000 drill bits pink, packaging them up in pink containers and shipping them out to their drill sites. So this is really not about breast cancer. This is about publicity for Baker Hughes. And once that publicity went sour, they've taken that partnership deep underground. That's not enough. We're asking Komen, the world's largest breast cancer charity, to break ties with the fracking industry. Komen is in a unique position to actually take a powerful stand to prevent this disease.
Right.
And again, it's just incredibly cynical and hypocritical for Komen to raise millions of dollars each year to try to cure the very disease that their corporate partners are helping to fuel.
So let's talk about this link between breast cancer or cancer in general and chemicals used in fracking. I mean, honestly, when I saw the pink drill bits that the Komen Foundation and Baker Hughes showed off, I thought it was satire. When I first saw the piece that broke the story, I thought I was reading The Onion. I mean, did nobody in the PR firms think that somebody might find it problematic that an organization that's raising money to do research on breast cancer is partnering with an organization, with an institution, a corporation that is using cancer-causing chemicals? So spell it out for us in case it's not obvious to Baker Hughes and Komen themselves.
Yeah, you're not alone. We also thought it was an Onion piece, and we had our partners checked out the Yes Men to see if it was a spoof. It was so outrageous. I do want to say that this is not the first time that Komen has done this. And, 2 years ago, we and our members sent letters to Komen and a different fracking company. This time it was Nomac. It's a subsidiary of Chesapeake Energy. They painted a drill rig pink with a big pink ribbon on it and installed it in rural Ohio. They gave $10,000 to the local Komen affiliate. So it's not the first time Komen has done this. What makes this unique is the just groundswell of public opposition to this kind of pinkwashing. And I think there'll certainly be questions if Komen would do this kind of partnership again. Fracking is an inherently dangerous practice. Companies pump millions of gallons of water mixed with millions of gallons of toxic chemicals deep underground to break up rock formations and free oil and gas. We know that of the 700 and plus chemicals, most of these are proprietary. We don't, companies aren't disclosing these chemicals by and large. And when tested, half of the chemicals are linked to a variety of health harms far beyond cancer, and a quarter of them are linked to cancer. breast cancer and other cancers. We know that workers on the site have high levels of benzene in their body, and benzene is a carcinogen linked to breast cancer and, again, other cancers. And the problem is not only for the workers, it's not only for the people in surrounding areas. We know that currently, today, 15 million Americans live within 1 mile of a fracked site. And that's exposing a lot of people to direct toxins there, at the site. But the problems go further than that, because once we've poisoned our water, that toxic water has nowhere to go, and whether it stays underground and has potential to contaminate our water supplies, or whether the dirty water is pumped up and continues to expose folks, we know that when that water is used to irrigate our agriculture, is used to water livestock, then those same toxins come into our food supply and come into our body. So this is really a dangerous process that is endangering our food, our water, our air, and our health.
Well, Karuna Jagger, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Can you give out a website for Breast Cancer Action where listeners can find out more? And also, are you still accepting signatures to that petition?
Yeah, you can go to bcaction.org. Again, that's bcaction.org. We have delivered our petitions. There's lots of ways that folks can take action and join us. We will always work to protect public health and be the watchdog for the breast cancer movement. So I encourage folks to join us and to take action on a variety of our campaigns. Again, bcaction.org.
And we'll post that website to our own site, uprisingradio.org. Karuna Jagger has been my guest. She is the executive director of the group Breast Cancer Action that confronted the Komen Foundation over the weekend over its partnership with the Baker Hughes company that engages in fracking around the world. This is Uprising. When we come back from break, we'll continue our coverage of how people are fighting against the oil drilling industry. This time, we'll speak with an Ecuadorian indigenous activist. Stay tuned.
Yeah, this song is called Time to Go.
This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A number of indigenous groups and farmers filed a complaint this week against oil giant Chevron at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Their complaint cites Chevron's refusal to clean up part of Ecuador's Amazon rainforest, which impacts the health of communities directly and amounts to, in their words, a crime against humanity. About 80 groups and organizations representing tens of thousands of affected people accused Chevron CEO John Watson of deliberately contributing to pollution of their environment. Ecuador's government has demanded that Chevron pay nearly $10 billion in cleanup fines, which the company has so far ignored. The Amazon rainforest is the largest such forest in the world and covers roughly the same area as the 48 contiguous United States. Part of the Amazon lie in 8 different South American countries, including Ecuador. Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa in 2007 asked the global community to contribute to a fund to preserve the Yasuni National Park, a significant portion of Ecuador's Amazon forest. The initiative, called Yasuni ITT, was eventually shelved, and now plans are underway to drill for oil in one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. Tired of waiting for compensation or cleanup, groups like the ones taking Chevron to the ICC are taking matters into their own hands. Also refusing to wait any longer is a youth-led organization called Yasunidos, whose mission is to protect and preserve the Yasuni National Park and keep the oil where it belongs, in the ground. Leo Cerda is an indigenous activist. He's a Quechua and a native of the city of Tena in the Ecuadorian Amazon and a member of Yasuninos. I spoke with him recently after he had just returned from the People's Climate March in New York. Welcome to Uprising, Leo Cerda.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, begin by telling our listeners a little bit about this incredible place that's considered one of the most biodiverse places in the world that probably most Americans have never heard of. We've heard of the Amazon, but within the Amazon, the Yasuni National Park, it's a place where in just an area of 2.5 hectares, of just 1 hectare rather, you can get tens of thousands of species of insects, thousands of species of trees. It sounds incredible.
Actually, in 1 hectare of the Yasuni National Park, you can find more species of animals and plants than the entire U.S. and Canada.
Wow.
To be in perspective, this place has been inhabited by people that decided to live in voluntary isolation. They're the last two groups in Ecuador that we know of that live in this area, and as and take this area as part of their territory and where they live, and they are showing us there are other ways of living, apart from the capitalist Western society that we live in involved right now. They are showing us there are other ways.
So there are indigenous groups that live in the Yasuni National Park.
Yeah, there are indigenous groups that live in the Yasuni National Park. There are two different kind of indigenous groups. The ones that live in solitary isolation and voluntary isolation. So they live in within their territory. They have no contact with like Western society. And there are other indigenous groups that live around the Yasuni National Park area, such as the Quichuas and the Guaranis that live like right in the Yasuni National Park.
So, in addition to it being one of the most biodiverse places in the world, unfortunately, it also has one of the largest oil reserves. And this is where the problems begin. Explain for our listeners what the political fight over that oil has been over the last several years. And this year, that fight seems to have come to a head.
Yeah, first of all, the Yasuni National Park is one of the biggest regions in the Amazon that carbon sinks, our air, and like that's where we get our fresh air and
when you
our
say
fresh
carbon
water.
sink, you basically mean trees that absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen.
Yeah, to the planet. So it's not only a local problem right now. It's an international planet problem because we all need the air that Yasuni gave us, and also during the 1990s, indigenous mobilizations and indigenous groups, environmental groups have like brought to this debate. What about the Yasuni? What can we do with the Yasuni since it's one of the most mega biodiverse places on Earth? Like with the president and the Ecuadorian government with the solemn authority on deciding what to do with the Yasuni National Park resources, or can the Ecuadorian people as well take a decision, and that decision-making process of deciding how they want to live and what kind of future do they want to give to their children and the future generations. So in 2007, long after indigenous fights and indigenous bringing this debate to the table, the Ecuadorian president decided to start the ITT initiative. The ITT stands for Ishpingo Tambococha Tiputini, which is the name of this area that we're talking about. And the Ecuadorian president,
Rafael
Correa, he decided to bring that to the international community and say, okay, we're going to keep the oil in the ground for an exchange of for economic exchange between like countries that want to pay for the Yasuni to keep the oil in the ground, and Ecuador in exchange will maintain this oil in the ground. So the president gave a speech at the UN, and he called out like the international community to support this idea. It was good, it was a great idea. It was like the first of this kind in nowadays. But one of the biggest problems was that President Rafael Correa wanted to keep the oil in the ground, and at the same time he had a plan B to extract the oil. So the international community didn't really believe what he was saying, because he was having dealings and like contracts with China, and at the same time he was asking the international community for support to keep the oil in the ground in the Yasuni National Park area, and the ITT specifically. And just last year, the 15th of August of 2013, he addressed it on national TV, and he told Ecuadorians that the Ecuadorian government will be drilling the Yasuni ITT area. And right after that, civil society came, uprising, because we had the debate. We dream for since 2007 to 2013, like kids, generations, believe in this idea of an alternative model in which we can keep the oil in the ground and look for alternative ways in which our planet can survive. So a lot of like civil society groups from different kinds of groups, like feminists, GLBT, indigenous nations, vegans, animalists, everybody came together. And as students, it was very like grateful to see all of us coming together for one reason, to save the life of the planet and to fight for life.
So, just to summarize, Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, gave the impression that he was interested in keeping the Yasuni oil under the ground, preserving it so that the Amazon and that part of the Amazon remained preserved. Asked for pledges from the world community, but they didn't take him seriously because at the same time he was doing deals with China. And so only a few $1 million came in out of the $1.3 billion that he was asking. And now he is taking that money and putting it elsewhere to combat poverty, I understand, and is going ahead with doing deals to drill underneath this area?
Yes. The Ecuadorian government only got $13 million, and there were other pledges, but it never became like real. So out of the $13 million, like we haven't seen them. I don't know what happened with that money. And yes, he's continuing doing deals with China. The contracts, like Ecuador is in debt with China a lot now. We've seen what China is doing all over Latin America and Africa. How like outrageous is coming. They need the resources. The Guardian actually made a really good investigation about about the Ecuadorian deals with China and the contracts, and he's going ahead. The government is going ahead towards the process of drilling oil from the Yasuni ITT. And our message to the world is basically, it's not only a local problem anymore. It's a global problem. The environment, the planet is a global problem now, because we need to do and take action right now if we want to have a planet to live in.
So the Ecuadorian government, I understand, issued very recently an apology to the Sarayuku indigenous community for giving away 400,000 acres of their land without permission to an oil company. This was all the way in 1996 that the land was first given away. So the community got an apology and $1.3 million, which is nothing. And it came 18 years after this incident. Does it seem as though we have, because of corporate greed, but even state greed, this sense of pilfer first and apologize later?
That's what the oil companies in alliance with the government's been doing. And just Sarayaku was apologized 2 days ago, and it was a half apology. That's what the community say in their press release, a half apology, because the government apologized for what happened, but they didn't say it will never happen again.
Right.
And this shows us how late justice comes to the indigenous communities, to the indigenous nations, because the government is supposed to be asking, prior consent and previous to the communities, and they don't do that. They just go, extract, like displace the communities, and then as in this case, more than 10 years later, they come and apologize and half apologize.
So in 2010, Chevron, which had also been drilling near the area in the Amazon and polluting the area, was ordered to pay $18 billion in damages by the Ecuadorian government. This was a case that was started in 1993 against Texaco, which Chevron then acquired. And Chevron has refused to pay these $18 billion in damages to the Ecuadorian government. The Ecuadorian government asked for $1.3 billion for the Yasuni ITT initiative. wouldn't this payment by Chevron more than cover that initiative? I mean, are they just letting Chevron get away with this?
That money of course, will be worth it for the Ecuadorian community and like to stop drilling in the Amazon. The Ecuadorian government sort of like took over the case because the case was, first of all, the case was started by the affected communities,
The
not
indigenous
the
communities.
indigenous
Mhm.
communities. So there there is an ambiguity. But now the government is drilling Yasuni, but at the same time they want to greenwash Ecuadorians and say, "Oh, we're helping the indigenous
Right.
community to fight Chevron." But at the same time, the problem in general is not because the contracts with China are supposed to be paid in oil, not in money. So
So Ecuador is in debt to China, and China expects its payment back in
but
oil, not
oil.
money. Wow.
Of course, yeah. That's how the contracts are stipulated, and the oil that has been sold to China is in current prices. We're not putting in perspective or how much the oil will cost in future years. You know.
So let's also talk about the potential impact to the Yasuni ITT. You started this conversation telling us about the incredible biodiversity of this place. We also have to put into perspective that a big percentage of pharmaceutical drugs are based on medicinal plants. And the Yasuni ITT represents a potential for humanity in terms of the biodiversity that's there. What could happen to this place if drilling were to start?
If drilling were to start in the Yasuni ITT, first of all the medicine, all the plants, and all those plants for the sacred valley that can be for a lot of use for humanity can be destroyed. You know, and also as I mentioned, Yasuni is one of the biggest carbon sinks of the planet. You know, and
Would it displace the people living
it
there?
will it will create genocide for the people if you take away the territory in which people live and that hunt and eat and acquire their medicine from. If you take that away, that could potentially be a genocide for the people that live in voluntary isolation because they will have nowhere to go and will eventually disappear from the planet. And also, it will elevate the heat on the planet. You know,
Right.
these
So it has
specific-
local implications and global implications
There's-
as well. So I want to ask you, Leo, about how you draw connections between the struggles in the indigenous communities of Ecuador, in the Amazon, and struggles of indigenous communities worldwide. I mean, we see similar struggles for First Nations people in Canada with the Alberta tar sands. Here in the U.S., we've had a long history of environmental racism in areas where our indigenous communities live. Do you see these struggles as being linked?
all those struggles, now the environment and the planet and the protection of the planet is one single fight, and coming from the People's Climate March in New York.
Were you there?
Yes, I was there in New York, and we worked with people from all around the globe. I was part of the indigenous section, and we see all these struggles, and that really empowered us, to do something locally, but to also now that we're a global movement and that our local fights are global fights now because we only have one planet. And with the indigenous people that have been defending and protecting their land, now we have to all fight together and do something and take action and urge the states to take action immediately to create new policies that will not affect indigenous territories and the planet because we need a planet to live in.
So the situation in the Yasuni area is pretty grim, and I'm wondering if you can explain for our listeners the kind of resistance on the ground. You're here in the United States explaining to our listeners what the importance of this issue is, but how are communities organizing to face the oil companies, to face the state on the ground? And do they have popular support within Ecuador from the urban population?
Yeah, right after the President Rafael Correa in Ecuador made the decision to drill in the Yasuni, a lot of people uprise and they came into the streets. A lot of the civil society groups formed, and that's why we formed the Yasunidos Collective. The Yasunidos Collective, that in which I am a member of, is a collective of collectives that defends the Yasuni National Park and also defend the Amazon of any kind of extraction, because all types of extraction affect our territory and affect the world that we live in. Not only for the indigenous people in the jungle, but the people in the cities of Ecuador are also, they know, and then we have established the debate. Yasunidos Collective actually collected more than 800,000 signatures to call up for a national referendum in Ecuador in order to ask Ecuadorians to see if Ecuadorians want to drill or not.
So like a public referendum?
Like a public referendum, a national referendum of an issue of a national interest, because we cannot allow only the government to have this decision made for us. It's the civil society, it's the people that need to take a decision. We have a say, because it's our future of our kids, it's our future of our future generations, it's the future of our territory for the indigenous.
Now, Leo, the Ecuadorian government under Rafael Correa, from our perspective in the United States, is seen as a left-leaning government. And we see that in other countries around Latin America as well. But having a left-leaning government is no guarantee of a respect for the planet, particularly when oil and fossil fuel resources are at stake, as we've seen in countries like even Venezuela. And so when we look at how the issue of climate change must be combated, how important is the grassroots? And I think you were sort of starting to answer that already, that the pressure from below is more important than installing, it seems, left-leaning leaders who we might think would take the position to respect the climate, but in the end give in to corporate interests.
The same thing happened, in Ecuador. That's what happened. President Rafael Correa came to power saying that he was leftist and saying that he was working with the indigenous groups and the indigenous leaders and all the leftist groups in Ecuador. But when he came to power and money went through, it all changed. And that's why it was, for us, very important. Even in Ecuador, like news, the media is being bought by the government. We don't have a right. We have very low political participation. The Ecuadorian government just changed the penal code and in order to criminalize protest. So it's very, very hard. And the only thing that we have is to become more empowered, like the civil society more empowered. And empower civil society, it's what we have. We have to create debate, we have to create the discussion, we have to bring the discussion to the national level, to every level, and that's what we've been doing in Ecuador, because we know how important is the Yasuni National Park and is the Amazon, and how important it is to have a safe planet to live in.
We were talking about China's pressure on Ecuador, but as I understand it, the U.S. is also a very large consumer of Ecuadorian oil, isn't it?
Yes.
And so that also puts a special onus on Americans. And I'm wondering what, during your trip to the United States, what sort of reaction you've had among Americans who've heard, because, we don't really pay attention to what's happening in the Amazon.
I think bringing that, the fossil fuels, the oil comes from the Amazon. And here in the cities such as LA, we have a high quantity of cars that you're consuming the oil from, even if not doesn't come from the Amazon, it has to come from somewhere.
Right.
And when the students, I talk mostly with students, they say, what we can do? And I tell them, you don't have to come to the Amazon and fight with us. You can start locally. There are the tar sands. California is getting without water. You can ask your own locals to divest from fossil fuels, because fossil fuels is the burning of fossil fuels is what is affecting our planet. We will not have a planet to live in, and we should start local as a grassroots level. You don't have to go to Ecuador and fight with us. We need solidarity groups. We need to fight locally and then form a global movement in which we can all act.
So we are hearing much about the clash these days between the health of the planet and the health of our economy. Folks like Naomi Klein have just started naming the fact that it's really these days capitalism versus the climate. What do you make of that analysis?
Is either we keep living the way we have, 100 years of capitalism, 200 years of capitalism, where it has brought us. We have to start like thinking about what it has brought us. Where is the planet at now? So it's about time to rethink on the way we live in the world, the way we see the world. Maybe we can learn from something from the indigenous communities that have been living and protecting their lives for thousands of years. And it's a matter of you want to keep living the way you have, or we should start thinking towards alternative economies, alternative models in which the planet can sustain itself on a long-term basis.
So the communities that live in the Yasuni ITT area have shown that humans can be compatible with the planet, that can live alongside these incredibly biodiverse species, maintaining trees, maintaining the animals and birds and insect populations. And so that sounds like a pretty difficult feat for those of us here living in the United States. But there are lessons to be learned from indigenous communities, just how to live with the planet rather than at the expense of the planet.
Exactly. We need to learn how to live in harmony with nature. That's how we, the indigenous people in the Amazon, say we need to learn from our territory. We need to live with our territory, and we need to see how we live in between those two, the knowledge and the territory. And that is a big lesson to learn.
Leo Cerda, I want to thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts on this issue. Best of luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you for creating this space.
I've been speaking with Leo Cerda, an indigenous activist, a Quechua, and a native of the city of Tena in the Ecuadorian Amazon. He's also a member of the Yasuninos Collective. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at money in our elections. The midterms are just 1 week away. Stay tuned.
Got music for your soul. Weight's gonna get much lighter. World's gonna look much brighter. No, the heat's gonna carry on. I'll make it through the night. Weight's gonna get much lighter. World's gonna look much brighter. No, the heat's gonna carry on. We'll make it through. They said we're feeling.
This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. The midterm elections are exactly 1 week away, and Democrats, who currently have a razor-thin majority in the Senate, have the most to lose. If the GOP wins a Senate majority and retains their House majority, we will have a Congress dominated by conservatives. Their financial benefactors are doing everything they can to make that happen. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision unleashed a torrent of cash that has increased rapidly, election to election. The Brennan Center for Justice recently released a report examining 9 competitive Senate races taking place on November 4th and the money coming to them from outside groups, many of which do not disclose their donors. Some of these so-called dark money groups are devoted to electing a single candidate, others a single party. And in a minute, we're going to be trying to understand just how strong and influence moneyed interests have on our elections, with my guest, Ian Vander Walker. He is author of the report that I've just mentioned and counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice's democracy programs. Now, the issue is quite confusing. There's money that can be directly donated to the official campaigns of the candidates, and that remains restricted. But then there's also non-candidate or outside spending money that is given to and spent by outside groups. Some of the groups disclose their donors and others don't, and that is called dark money spending. So it's an issue that many of us do need to pay attention to. The problem is there's very little information about it, either from the media or, of course, from the candidates themselves. As you brace yourself for the robocalls and the advertisements that are going to be bombarding you, let us take a listen to what Ian Vander Walker has to say about this issue. Welcome to Uprising, Ian.
Hi, thank you.
So it's quite confusing. I just laid this out for our listeners about the myriad kinds of groups. You know, when the Citizens United decision came down, people thought that corporations would be the ones spending an unrestricted amounts of money on the elections. But it's actually these dark money groups. Explain to us what they are.
That's right. So dark money groups, they can take a few different forms. Some of them are nonprofit organizations that were the forum was originally created to allow people to engage in social welfare or charity activities, and they're being used now after Citizens United for political spending, precisely because the donors to these groups don't have to be supported. So as you said, people thought that corporate spending would explode after Citizens United, and we didn't see direct corporate spending increase. But now there's all these dark money groups. We don't know where that money comes from, and it could very well come from corporations.
So essentially, corporations, but also wealthy individuals, could simply give money to a nonprofit or a political action committee that they feel is going to pump a lot of effort into getting a particular candidate elected, and they can just give as much as they want, and they can keep the fact that they're giving it secret. I mean, that essentially means the Koch brothers, if they wanted, could get as many people elected as they wanted, because they've just got a lot more disposable cash than the rest of us do.
It's true that there are some people. There are only a few people out of the enormous population of the United States that can take advantage of these new mechanisms. And part of what's disturbing about it is it leaves the public in the dark as to, when I see this ad, who's trying to talk to me? Is it some special interest? Is it someone who has my interest at heart? And also, what are the relationships that are being based on that spending? Because it's likely that the candidates and the people in these political networks know where the money is coming from, even though the public doesn't.
And so wasn't the Supreme Court's justification for Citizens United based in part on the public having access to disclosure, that if they knew who was funding some of these campaigns, that they would be able to make those decisions about who to vote for?
Yes, that's right. The decision talks about, in this day and age, we have effectively immediate disclosure. And unfortunately, that promise simply is not real. That's just not the world that we live in. Citizens United instead opened the door to this flood of outside money, most of which, at least in competitive races, most of which comes from these groups who don't disclose their donors. So we just don't know where it's coming from.
Now, Ian, why did you choose these 9 Senate races that your report examines? How did you decide which races to look at, and what spending period does it actually cover? Because the election's still a week away.
Right. Well, we looked at the competitive Senate races because, the Senate is up for grabs in this election. These are the races that are going to decide which party controls the Senate. And we've seen in the past that money follows those kinds of properties, that the competitive races that are going to decide if one side or the other controls a chamber, that's where most of the money is going to be, and most of the dark money and a lot of the outside money. So we wanted to look at the places that are likely to be the biggest targets of this kind of spending. Sorry, I forgot the second half.
And so the question is, doesn't this period that your study cover exclude, this last couple of weeks of funding? I mean, we might see the most expenditures in the last week or two of the election, before the election.
That's right. Historically, most of the spending, half or even 3/4, has come in October and November. And our report, because of the way the FEC filing deadlines are set up, only covers through the beginning of October. So the numbers are likely to get much, much higher, twice as high.
Now, North Carolina, I found your report also found that is the state where the most money has been spent. Did you find any kind of correlation, any reason why North Carolina might have the most money spent? Any significant difference between states for reasons that you might be able to share?
Well, it's a little hard to say. You know, North Carolina is one of these states. This is common in our sample, where it's seen as a red state that has a freshman Democratic senator. So the Republicans think it's an easy, or maybe not easy, but it's a place to pick off a seat. North Carolina also has, you know, expensive media markets in it, so it's a place where the spending can rack up pretty quickly.
So there are groups that are spending money directly on individual candidates. And to get individual candidates elected. And then there are groups like Senate Majority PAC, which you also describe in your report, that are devoted to simply getting one party as many seats as possible. Tell us about Senate Majority PAC. Now, this is a pro-Democrat group, not a pro-Republican group.
That's right. Senate Majority PAC is a super PAC that was set up by former aides to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. And there are even indications that he has told people to give money to the group. So, and it is spent in the exact same races that the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the official committee of the Democrats, has spent. So in some sense, it is an outside group, but it has these very close ties to the Democratic Party. So almost so close that you might want to say that it's an arm of the Democratic Party. And it calls into question the idea that this outside spending is truly independent rather than in some sense and effectively a contribution to the party itself.
Now, what sort of levels of money are we talking about here? You know, for many for the majority of Americans, for 99% of Americans, the amount of money that these wealthy corporations are spending on getting a single candidate elected is more money than we might see in our entire lifetime. Can you share some of these numbers with us?
Sure. I mean, it's routine to see six-figure contributions to some of these super PACs. There's a super PAC that's devoted to electing Republican Joni Ernst in Iowa that is virtually fully funded by one individual who gave $350,000. You know, at the party level, the Senate Majority PAC party contribution limits are $64,000 in a 2-year cycle. But some of the people have given to Senate Majority PAC $5 million. Tom Steyer has given $10 million to Senate Majority Super PAC. So these are, you know, vast amounts of money that, as you say, almost no one in America can afford to give that amount of money, and they're much, much larger, many times larger than even the contribution limits to these entities that are being supported.
Why is it okay? Why is it legal for many of these corporate donors to remain anonymous? Is there any kind of legislation in the works to reveal these donors?
Yes, absolutely. The Disclose Act in Congress was introduced many years ago and has come very close to passing. It came within one vote of beating a filibuster in 2010. The Disclose Act would eliminate dark money as we know it completely. There would be no more dark money groups anymore if the Disclose Act were to pass. But it has been opposed by some Republicans in the Senate, especially Mitch McConnell, who led two filibusters against it successfully.
So we talked about the groups themselves that are doing the spending on behalf of their wealthy donors. But how much do we know about donors? I mean, presumably some donors, some corporate donors are known. There's, you know, certainly research being done. Or are they all keeping us in the dark about how much money they're giving? What do we know about who is giving the most money?
No, lots and lots of donors are known. Most super PACs get a lot of money from individuals, and they report all of those individuals. You know, I mean, the people who tend to give tend to be rich people who can afford to give, people who can give in very large amounts. They tend to be sort of the same people. You'll see the same donors give to many of these groups. You mentioned the Koch brothers. the Koch brothers, we think, give to many of the groups in their network. People like Tom Steyer, he gives to the Democratic Party, he gives to Democratic candidates, he gives to his own super PAC focused on climate change issues. So they're politically, ideological individuals who tend to favor one side or the other and can afford to give a lot of money.
Now, Ian, one of the other things that your report alluded to is the cooperation between candidates that do benefit directly from the expenses of these outside groups and the groups themselves. They're supposed to remain separate. The Supreme Court Citizens United decision was supposed to be enabling corporations and unions, although they don't have the same kind of money as corporations do, to be able to elect who they want to elect because they see their money as free speech. But there are restrictions on how much money can go directly to the campaigns of the candidates and unlimited now amounts going to these outside groups. The outside groups are supposed to remain separate from the candidates themselves. Is that happening?
Well, less and less. I mean, there are rules about separation. And the reason, again, as you said, is the Supreme Court said, look, yes, we have contribution limits of $5,200 to federal candidates, but everybody has the right to go and say what they want to say on their own. The problem is if I go and say what I want to say, but I'm really helping one candidate, then everybody who gives me money to do that knows that they're helping that one candidate, which calls into question the reality of the contribution limits. And what we see is that these single candidate groups that can accept unlimited contributions and spend all the money in favor of one candidate tend to overlap with the candidate in interesting ways. So they'll be run by former high-ranking staff of the candidate. They'll use the same vendors for political strategy or messaging strategy. They'll even take campaign footage and use it in their own ads that they're putting together. The candidates will sort of publicly post things on their website saying, we're going to be putting on ads in this week and not that week, which is a not so subtle hint to the outside group to fill the holes in the advertising schedule. So there are a lot of ways to cooperate without going up to the line of illegal coordination that's supposedly protecting us from these outside groups just being armed for the campaign.
I want to thank you very much, Ian Vander Walker, for joining us today, and we'll post a link to your website and the report by the Brennan Center. Ian Vander Walker is the author of the report that we've been just talking about. He's a counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice's Democracy Program. This is Uprising, and Bipasha Shom is our producer and program director. Christian Beck and Camilo Ramirez are our interns. Brett Collins and Alexander Hobbs are our technical directors. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Our theme music is by Quetzal. Find us online at uprisingradio.org. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the handle Uprising Radio. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.